I think soup being a waste of time is self-explanatory. All right, so I'm so glad to be here at Write the Docs. I love all y'all. This has been so much fun. This is not actually true. I just want y'all to feel better about having lasted through almost the end of the conference. Also, can we get a shout out to Vanessa, who's been doing all the captioning? Like, that is some super hard work. And also, my goal for this talk, you're supposed to have goals for a talk, is that I want her to have to type square brackets, laughter, close square brackets, a lot. So let's just keep that in mind. So hi, I'm Erin, and if that big logo on the first slide didn't tell you, I'm also a developer advocate for IBM in San Francisco, and I also founded and I run wordnik.com, which I like to call the world's largest dictionary that no one's ever heard of. We are actually the largest dictionary in the world by an order of magnitude, by number of words, not traffic, sadly. And we also have an API with more than 20,000 registered users. And so if any point in my talk you're like, oh my God, I have to tweet this, that's my Twitter handle. So at Wordnik, we really believe that there's a place in the dictionary for every word, including the made-upical ones. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and our mission is to collect and share every word of English. And before founding Wordnik, I was the editor-in-chief of American Dictionaries for Oxford University Press. And there I made dictionaries that looked more like this. And before working for OUP, I worked on children's dictionaries, and this is just a very long way of saying that I've been working on dictionaries for my entire adult working life. And people often ask me if it was hard transitioning from full-time lexicography to developer relations and part-time lexicography. But it turns out that there's a lot of overlap, because in both fields you're constantly learning, assimilating a lot of information, and then trying to put that information into a shape that makes it easily accessible to people who are generally highly impatient and largely unappreciative. And so first I want to talk a little bit about how dictionaries are made, especially now that dictionaries are kind of transitioning back to their Johnsonian and Websterian roots, where they're no longer made by large teams at multinational corporations and are instead made largely by solo cranks like me. So I know when I talk about how dictionaries are made, this is what the hey! Woot! This is the only place that slide has ever gotten this reaction. That dude is super creepy. So you can claim with only a little bit of exaggeration that dictionaries are the technical documentation for the English language, for the moving parts of the English language, for the words. Dictionaries are documentation, but because they're so old, they've gotten kind of a literary sheen on them. We don't really think of them as technical docs, but really that's what they are. And so this is James Murray. He was the first real editor of the Oxford English Dictionary. I mean, the first one who didn't spend most of his time teaching waitresses how to row boats. Look it up, that's true. And dictionaries are really the original data-driven documentation. Behind James are a bunch of citation slips, and how dictionary entries are made is that all the examples of how a word is used are boiled down into a definition. A dictionary definition is just a literary form, like a sonnet, or one of those "our startup got acquired but nothing will change" Medium posts. And so when I started working as a developer advocate, mostly writing readmes and how-tos and tutorials, I realized that there was a lot of overlap, so thus this talk. And so I want to talk a little bit today about the things that are the same and the things that are different, and use my experience as a lexicographer to talk about documentation. And so the obvious thing that's the same is that both the lexicographer and the technical writer are asking this question of their audience. And we've heard a lot at this conference about what our audience wants. They want to get stuff done. They have task-based goals. They have to-do lists. But sometimes users, they have things that they need to get done, right? And that's what they tell you that they want from documentation. But sometimes users also want reassurance. People look up words in the dictionary all the time, not because they don't know what the words mean. They want reassurance that the rest of the world also thinks that those words mean the same thing, that people agree with them. And this is actually the same reason that people write blog posts about their software architecture and post it to Hacker News. They want reassurance. They want to feel like they're part of a group. And sometimes people don't just want the knowledge that they're right, but they also want to know that someone else is wrong. And dictionaries, we already had an obligatory Inigo Montoya reference earlier today, which I'm very happy about. Dictionaries do this by privileging standard English, and documentation does this by highlighting best practices. It's something you can point to and say, yes, everyone agrees with me, you're wrong. And another thing that lexical and technical audiences also have in common is that they're usually driven to seek out documentation by some kind of lack. That same task-driven urgency that brought them to us also means that they want to, as in Ashley's great talk yesterday, they want us to cut to the chase. But nobody reads the front matter of the dictionary, literally no one. You could put obscenities in 32-point type and they would go undiscovered for years. And it also makes me really nervous to think about how many people skip the prerequisites section of basically everything. And when I first heard the acronym ARID, accept some repetition and documentation, I was like, yes, that's why traditional print dictionaries put the pronunciation key on every spread, because we know no one's ever going to go look for it anywhere else. But we know that people don't read everything all the way through. We know that people jump to the places where they think the data that interests them will be. But this is one of the things that makes technical documentation a bit more difficult than dictionaries, because the norms of technical documentation are relatively young. But dictionaries have had 400 years to beat the norms of dictionary use into our users. So there are some things that we just don't have to explain anymore, like alphabetical order. But the first dictionaries had to explain alphabetical order. So this is a dictionary from 1604. It's generally considered to be one of the first dictionaries in English, a table alphabetical. It was for ladies, gentlewomen, and other unskillful persons. And so they say, hey, if you want to use this dictionary, you have to learn the alphabet, to wit, the order of the letters in which they stand. And if something begins with the letter B, it's going to be near the beginning. You literally had to explain this to people. And I think about Caudry and this explanation all the time when I'm writing how-tos, because what do I assume that people know about the structure of this document that they may actually have to be taught, like alphabetical order in the 1600s? And so in terms of technical documentation, one of the things we found when we were first documenting the WordNik API, which is where Swagger was born, OpenAPI, was actually started at WordNik by my technical founder, Tony Tam, is when we showed the API calls in the Swagger documentation, we didn't include the API key because we thought everybody knows that. And then I had to answer so many emails from people who said the API doesn't work. And yes, it doesn't work if you don't include your API key. And now almost all API documentation has very explicit instructions about how to auth, because you have to show people. You can't just assume that they know. It was something that really brought something home to me that I believe truly, even more than I believe that soup is a waste of time, that exemplars always beat explanations. So a dictionary definition is a kind of explanation. And sometimes it's only an explanation in form and not in force. This is a pretty classic example of a bad definition from Samuel Johnson, but Samuel Johnson was a badass and well worth fangirling over. I bet you didn't think there were going to be so many long S's in a talk on technical documentation, right? But examples beat explanations every time. We're all familiar with a picture being worth 1,000 words and show, don't tell. But the problem is that sometimes it is so incredibly satisfying to explain things that we indulge in the explanation and forget the exemplar. I mean, in Anglophone culture, we actually have a specific word for people who inflict self-indulgent explanations onto people who are not actually in need of them. Everybody knows this word, right? Yeah, thank you, guy in the front row, mansplaining. I did not mean to set you up like that. That was totally unintentional. So my advice is if you have to get it out of your system, write up the explanation, put it on Tumblr or somewhere where it can't hurt anybody, and use the space that you've saved for more examples. And so at WordNick, we actually try to have examples that are also explanations. Does anybody here drink picklebacks? I hope not, it sounds disgusting. I don't know either. So pickleback, I always check right before I show an example of we call these free-range definitions because they're sentences that are out in the world that serve as definitions. This is not in any dictionary, and I don't know why, because it's disgusting or just because it's a very low-frequency word. But examples can also provide context that's either missing or highly encoded in explanations. And in dictionaries, the definition format is very highly encoded and carries a heavy load, mostly due to paper-based space constraints that have carried over into the digital world. I'll give you one example. How many entries is this? How many people know that this is a trick question and are just waiting to hear the answer? This is actually 5 entries. It's one word, right? But the Department of Defense actually has a set of guidelines for how you count the number of entries in a dictionary. And what happens is the first bold word counts as 1. The first part of speech is still 1, so now you've got 1 total. Every additional part of speech adds +1. Every bold word that's not defined elsewhere in the book is another +1. So here we've got crimp and verb is 1, crimped is 2, noun is 3, phrase is 4, derivative, crimpy is 5. This is not something that lay people know. I have like a mimeographed copy of this Department of Defense thing from the 70s. But when you see on the outside of the book how many definitions, how many entries something has, this is how they're counting. And I'm showing you this from the New Oxford American Dictionary where I was an editor, because on WordNick this goes on for like 3 scrolls, because we have a lot of data. So when a form like this has encoded meaning, what is lost when you shift from one form to another? I mean, the typography here does a ton of heavy lifting too. And you have to kind of be an expert in what this means in order to understand it. And that's another thing that I think lexicography and technical writing have in common, or should have in common, is that we need to value expertise over experts. If every lexicographer had to be an expert on every word, we would never have any dictionaries. A lexicographer's expertise is in sorting through the evidence of a word's use and then presenting it to you in a digestible form. And in fact, experts can be terrible at writing definitions because they know too much. And it can be the same with technical documentation. Like, don't get me wrong, having experts review things for errors is great, and you should always do that if you can. But it's more important to be able to show people the path to expertise than to make them experts themselves. And I think it's important to differentiate between skills and knowledge. You can use a word correctly. You can have the skills to use a word without being able to use every sense of that word correctly or to know anything about its etymology. In the same way, you can use an API to get something done and know nothing about the implementation of that API on the back end. And in fact, knowing about a word's etymology, knowing too much about a word's etymology or too much about an API's implementation actually leads you to sometimes do things based on this hidden knowledge, which isn't actually how the world works. And if you emphasize knowledge, which can feel static, over skills, which should be dynamic, you run into another problem, which is people hate change. Lots of people hate language change. Lots of people hate software versioning. There are some people, I'm sure, who are out there looking forward to the heat death of the universe because then nothing will ever change again. And I don't really have very many tips on how to deal with these people other than to say, they're there, it's okay, and soothing tones. But for language, it's easier. When people are mad about a new word, I can say, hey, nobody's forcing you to use this new word, but the other side of that coin is you are not protected from the consequences if you're being offensive, right? You can refuse to change, but that doesn't mean you get a free pass. For tech, it's harder. We all have things that we cling to. I just upgraded to High Sierra and realized that Text Wrangler has been end-of-lifed for like over a year. I was like, oh. It's okay, BB Edit seems to be fine. But really, when talking with people who hate change, it can be very difficult. And so sometimes I quote Alexander Pope at them because that just confuses them entirely. But I think, hundreds of years ago, he had the right idea, which is, be not the first by whom the new is tried, nor yet the last to lay the old aside. So is anybody else still using Text Wrangler? So I'm not the last person. Yes, I'm not the last person. But fear of change in language or in tech is really fear of the unknown. And the only thing that cures fear of the unknown is getting people to feel curiosity instead. And here is one place where dictionaries have an advantage because people expect them to be dull. I mean, there are people who read the dictionary for fun, and I know there are a lot of you here, and if you want recommendations of particularly fun dictionaries to read, I can give you some later. But it's out of the ordinary enough to be remarkable. I mean, there aren't people who say, I read webcomics for fun, or I watch The Good Place for fun, because those are normal things, right? You do those things for fun. Those things are expected to be enjoyable. So I was used to people expecting that dictionaries were going to be boring, and that's one of the things I had to unlearn when I started writing more technical documentation. In documentation, if things are boring, it's your fault. And that's harsh, but it's true. And part of this is capitalism, right? If you're writing a documentation for a product and then documentation is boring or dull or unhelpful, that product's not going to make as much money and you might get fired. And that's not how things work for the English language. Even if a great dictionary makes you use many more words, no money will change hands, and that's why WordNic's now a nonprofit. But you don't have to do outrageous things or stage car chases with creepy clowns and DeLoreans to make your work exciting or at least not boring. I mean, traditional dictionaries for a long time has had being stiff and kind of upright as part of their branding, and we all know that that's changing now. Like the people on Twitter for Merriam-Webster and Dictionary.com are just killing it. There are also lots of tech products now that have a very friendly tone online, but it's important for that conversational friendliness, that tone, to carry over from social media into the product itself, into the documentation itself, because it's very jarring to follow a link from like a jokey, me-malicious tweet to like a gray wall of very dry text. WordNic from the beginning was supposed to be friendly, like a friendly alternative to traditional dictionaries, and when we changed our logo very early on to have a heart in it, I got one piece of user feedback because we had violated Paul Ford's like law of the internet, why wasn't I consulted? And, and the feedback was, it's too girly. And I was like, that carries no weight with me, like, duh, girl. So, and this isn't really related to technical documentation. Well, a little bit it is. If you have an opportunity for people, for your users to contribute to your documentation, either with how-tos or examples or just participating, give them the space to do things that are fun. There's a user on WordNic who has written a limerick about the word of the day every day since 2014. He is one of my favorite people on the planet. Just a wonderful man. And if we had been like, hard asses about things and deleted his comments when he started writing limericks, that fun would have dissipated. Is this an on-label use for dictionaries? No, but it's awesome. And in the same way, there are a lot of people using the WordNic API to make Twitter bots, the fun kind, not the Russian kind. And opening the door to that kind of user participation really goes a long way into making your documentation unboring. So be not boring was an easy thing to learn or unlearn, but there are other things that were less easy. And so when you work on dictionaries, you're kind of used to basically everyone being your audience. Dictionary users are segmented into 3 groups: native speakers, learners, and children. That's it. Those are 3 very broad buckets of the population. Now I mostly write for node developers who are newish to APIs, which is like a fraction of dictionary users, and a much smaller segment of the general population. And going from a focus where I think everybody should be able to do X when it's read a dictionary definition to everyone should be able to do X when it's create your API and generate an open API specification, that was a little difficult transition to make. But it was fun. I really enjoy having a focused audience that I can talk directly to, much like documentarians. Another thing that I had to unlearn was the fear of making mistakes. Printing an error in a paper dictionary that someone gets for high school graduation and then never replaces for the rest of their life, that sucker's out there for eternity. That's traumatic. But an error in online documentation, while wildly suboptimal, is usually fixable. And an error in a presentation is usually great. You guys got to the end of this sign now, didn't you? I don't go out of my way to make errors when I'm live coding or giving presentations, but when I do, I really like it as a way to model recovering from bugs, showing how to fix a problem, showing how to reason about things when things go wrong, where there's no reasoning about a typo in a dictionary. Yes, we made a typo. That's done. Maybe you should buy a new dictionary at college graduation. That argument never works. The last thing that I had to unlearn, or rather give up, and was something that I was happy to give up, and that was the idea of being an authority. Too often, authority ossifies, it becomes fragile, it breaks, and when it's gone, it's really difficult to get it back. I want people to come to the documentation that I write, to the tutorials that I write, to the how-tos that I show and the readmes, not because I'm an authority, because I'm not, but because what I've created is useful, because it was created because I had empathy for their problems, because I saved them from doing things the hard way, and I helped them to see how they can learn what they need to learn and do what they need to do faster, better, cheaper, easier, and with more joy. Because authority is, I feel like authority these days is a falsifiable thing, right? You can never prove that someone is an authority, you can only prove that they're not. And with the amount of information that's available online, you can falsify anyone's authority. Whether the information is true or not, there's always something out there that's gonna contradict. But it's pretty easy to prove that something is helpful. Did it help you? Then it's helpful. Did it do the thing that you needed it to do? Helpfulness and empathy are always more useful than authority and easier to make people see as valuable. And also, frankly, empathy and helpfulness is a lot more fun than authority. And I love working on WordNick. I love writing technical documentation and how-tos around APIs and helping developers. Because at the end of the day, it's really all about helping people with information and maybe making the world a better place. And so I really hope that you feel the same way. Also about soup. I hope you feel the same way about soup. So let's have a few links. So IBM is my employer, and they graciously paid for me to come to Portland, which is always a great time. So if you would like to sign up for a free IBM Cloud Lite account, that would be awesome. Some of the documentation that we as a team create, I didn't create this pattern personally, but we have these code patterns which are kind of like craft kits, but for code. You know, you buy a craft kit and it's got all the yarn and everything you need to make the thing. Well, code patterns are like that, but for building an API, perhaps. And if you love APIs as much as I love APIs, or even half as much, I would really love you to consider talking at API Strat this fall in Nashville, Tennessee. The CFP is open now. The conference is run by the Linux Foundation. And so we really, really, really want to encourage people to come and talk about documentation for APIs. The good, the bad, the ugly, the swagger. And Swagger is now Open API. It's very confusing because it used to be called Swagger. It's no longer called Swagger. It still has Swagger. Some of the tools are trademarked as Swagger. So if you would like to give a short lightning talk at the conference explaining all of this, it would probably be very useful. So here are the last links. You can find me on Twitter and on GitHub. I'd also like to give a shout out to all the awesome people on Flickr who CC licensed their images so that I can use them in completely different contexts. And if you Because this is share-alike licensed, if you would like a copy of all these slides so you can give a completely different talk using the same images in the same order, I would be happy to make that available to you. And I think that this is the moment that a lot of you have been waiting for. I am also the founder of the Semicolon Appreciation Society. I must hasten to point out that you can appreciate the semicolon from whatever distance you need to in order for maximum appreciation to happen. So if you appreciate the semicolon a lot more when you don't have to use them, that is a perfectly fine modality for appreciating the semicolon, but I have a large chunk of stickers to give away, and I will do that for the rest of the day. So I'll just leave the links up one more time. Oops, sorry. Thank you so much for your kind attention. I really appreciate it.